This is Beyond with Heather Tesch, where we examine near-death experiences and life itself, hopefully making this life a little better. Hello, everybody. Welcome, and welcome to my guest, Heidi Barr.
Hi, Heather. How are you?
I am fabulous, Heidi. I am so happy to have you here today. I've been so enthralled with your story. I heard it from another one of my guests, and that was John Burke. And I also have read your book, and it was amazing. And we'll cover some of the stuff today that's in your book, but there's a lot there. So I would encourage people to get it. And we'll talk more about that coming up. But Heidi, you had a near-death experience when you were 16 years old, and everybody wants to hear about it. I know I want to hear about it. So just take us there and step us through what happened to you.
I always feel like this is the candy part. This is the treat. It's the really good stuff. I had always loved horses. And when I was 14, my father took a horse in trade from a person he did work for. The individual didn't have a lot of money, but he did have horses, and he gave him a horse. And I loved her. Her name was Heather, which I love the flower, Heather. So on the day in question, I had driven out to the ranch. I had turned 16 just that April, and this was end of April, early May. I brought my sisters with me because they like to hang out at the ranch. And I decided to ride by myself. Normally, I would ride with a friend, but she was sick that day. She had a horse too. She got a horse the same time I got my horse. So I took off on my own, which was not a problem. And when I came through the barn with my horse, I retrieved her from the paddock, came through the barn, and a gentleman was arguing with his wife over whether or not he could ride her Arabian mare. The Arabian mare was really hard to control. She was very bad tempered. Whenever I had to walk near her, I tried to avoid her as much as possible because she would kick or bite. And the only person I'd ever seen riding her was this woman. And even then I would avoid them if I was ever on the trails, and she happened to be on the trails at the same time. But I just ignored the argument, took Heather outside to the hitching post, groomed her, and hopped on her back. I was riding bareback. I didn't have a saddle. So I took off on the trails for about an hour. Charlie, the ranch owner, had about 500 acres of trails. And in fact, his ranch is still open and he still runs it. And, it was a really nice day. It was partly cloudy. It wasn't too cold, wasn't too hot. It was just a nice spring day and, not humid, which is typical of, Iowa in the summer, but it was still not humid. And after about an hour, I decided to come back because I thought my sisters are probably getting bored. So I turned and headed back towards the barn, but I stopped partway on kind of this overlook, this area where I could just stand and have a really nice view. I could see my sisters. I could see the barn. I could see activity happening around me or below me. And I suddenly heard hoofbeats. And I knew exactly what that meant. That meant that the man had won the argument. He'd taken out the Arabian mare and he was out of control, and she was racing back to the barn. So I had nowhere to go. I was kind of at a dead end. And I thought, okay, most of the time when horses are out of control, they race back to the barn. She will turn down the trail towards the barn and avoid me. But she didn't. And I saw her come flying around the corner. The man had dropped the reins. I actually thought, I hope she doesn't step on the reins because she's going to flip and he's going to get hurt. But I thought, okay, she'll turn the corner and head down to the barn, but she didn't. She came straight towards me. And I thought, she will see my horse and she'll stop. She'll calm down, but she didn't. And I thought she's going to, I thought in my head, what do I do? Do I get off? But I had nowhere to go either. If I got off, I was afraid she might trample me. So I thought I might be safer on the horse. So I stayed on Heather's back, but the horse kept coming. The Arabian mare kept coming. And as she approached really fast at a fast gallop, Heather reared up. The first time she reared up, she came back down, but this horse pretty much clipped Heather, came within inches of Heather's rump before she turned around. The second time Heather reared up, she stepped off the sloping hill, flipped over backwards, onto me. So I could see, you know, I was holding onto her mane. I could see us going backwards. I knew she was going to fall across my body. And the minute her back hit my chest, I left my body. I was 30, 40 feet up in the air. I saw my body. I saw Heather roll over my body, and I was tossed like a rag doll. That's the only way I can describe it. I looked like Raggedy Ann. I knew I was dead, and I was okay. I wasn't worried about myself. I was concerned about my horse. I wanted to make sure she was okay. And I saw my sisters. My little sister screamed and covered her face with her hands. My other sister was already in the car, and she was staring out the window of the car with a look of horror on her face. And I thought, I wish my sisters didn't have to see me die. That was my one thought at that moment. And as I thought that, I saw a light over my right shoulder. It was a golden light flowing over my right shoulder, and it was illuminating everything in front of me. And I knew it wasn't the sun, because the sun would have been higher in the sky. This was afternoon, 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was actually 3:30, right around 3:30, which is weird that I even know that. And because I don't wear a watch. And I turned to look, and there up in the air with me was a man. And he was smiling at me, and I smiled at him, and I recognized him immediately. And he moved forward until he was right next to me. And I said, I know you, which is very odd because I'm Jewish, raised by an atheist father and an agnostic mother. And we never, our only discussions of God in the household were to deny his existence. And I knew this was Jesus. I recognized him instantly. And, I was just so happy to see him. He was so happy to see me. It was this great reunion. I was ecstatic to see him. And he showed me, I had known him my whole life. He showed me a life review right then. He kind of held out his hand. And when you're having a life review, it's interesting because there's no time, and you see all of your life at once. I saw all of my life at once, like a 3D movie, but it was sequential, but it was also all at once. And I could relive every part of it, not only from my perspective, but the perspective of everyone I was interacting with. And I realized as I was watching my life that Jesus wasn't judging me. He was comforting me as I judged myself, as I judged my own actions. And I was actually a pretty good kid. It's kind of interesting because he wasn't nagging. He wasn't finger pointing. He just showed me things. He showed me how I affected other people, how other people felt regarding what I did or said. He didn't talk about all the ways I had been hurting myself, using drugs, hanging out with a pretty rough crowd, doing very self-destructive things. I wasn't a bad person. I hadn't deliberately set out to hurt people, but I realized my words and my actions affected far more than me, that in fact, they affected people forever. They were kind of permanent. And I was really, it stopped me in my tracks because I realized as I was watching this, I didn't want to ever do anything like that again. But at the same time, that while we were watching my life, there were some really funny moments in my life, and he and I were laughing our heads off. I saw him from the time I was formed in my mother's womb. I saw him with me, talking to me when I was a baby. I saw him all through my childhood. He was always with me. He was never not with me. And after I had this life review, he took my hand, and I wish I could describe it better, because it was like flying. Like I always say, it was like Superman and Lois Lane in the original Superman movie when they were flying. But it was surfing, because we were riding a wave of light. There was a wave of light under our feet, and I could feel it tickling the bottoms of my feet. So I know my feet were bare. I had feet. And I looked down, and I could see my feet and his feet. His feet were also bare. And the light was made up of all colors, and it was pushing us faster and faster. We were I recognized things and places and trees, and I recognized Earth for a while, but very quickly we left Earth and kind of zooming through the universe. It was just this really wild ride. I saw stars. I saw a galaxy. I saw just the vastness of space. And we were going faster and faster and faster. And Jesus actually looked at me at one point and he said, "This is so cool. Isn't this cool?" And I was like, "Yes, this is the coolest thing I have ever done." It was the most fun I've ever had. And we laughed and we chatted all the way through this journey. We were chatting the entire time. Now, don't ask me everything we said because I can't remember. But we came to what I can only describe as a threshold. And I know that a lot of people say there was a threshold they couldn't cross. This particular threshold I could cross with Jesus. And as we approached that threshold, I realized that before we approached the threshold, there was individuation. I could see individual things. As we approached the threshold, everything became one thing, and that one thing was God. And I realized there is no place where there is not God. God is everywhere. He's animates all things. So I got that. And as we crossed the threshold, I saw a light. And it was beautiful. It was infinite in its scope. And it was blemishless. And that's the word that came to my mind, blemishless. It was perfect. And the light was alive. The light was love. And the next thing, Jesus took me directly into the light, directly. And the next thing I knew, I was sitting on God's lap. And this was God the Father. But the only way I can, and I have no words to describe this, but Jesus was there too. And I was sitting on God the Father, and he's a really big God, and I was like a toddler sitting on his lap. He had his arms around me. I had my arms around him. I tried to sneak a glance up to see his face, but I couldn't see his face. It was shrouded. And I was just kicking my feet like a little kid. And I have never felt so loved. I was loved. I was accepted. This was my Father. This was my Father. Meeting Jesus was like meeting my father, my brother, my best friend, all rolled into one. This was my Father. And I sat there on his lap with my face buried in his chest. I never wanted to leave. I wanted to stay there forever. And God kind of moved. Somehow he indicated to me that I should lift my head, which I did. And here is this infinite God. He took up every space. There was no space where he wasn't. But what you have to picture, I'm trying to put it in human terms, is this infinite, really big God with this infinite, really big white robe. He's extending infinitely in all directions through time and space. And he withdrew a portion of his robe, like really far away, infinitely far away. He pulled back a portion of his robe so I could see something. And first I saw grass, which the grass was almost the best thing. Next to God, the grass was the coolest thing there. It was this perfect green, living grass. And here I was infinitely far away. And in real life, I was nearly blind, but infinitely far away. And I could see every single blade of grass in this infinite sized meadow. If I could have counted every blade of grass, I could have counted them. That's how clear they were. And I'm staring at the grass, just fascinated by this grass because it's green, but it's the essence of green. It's actually real green. So I realized as I was looking at this grass that the grass we see here on earth, it's green too, and it's grass too, but it's a reflection of the color of the grass in heaven. And I looked a little further and I saw flowers, just everywhere, flowers. But the flowers I kept focusing on, my eyes kept coming back to, were these really dark blue purple flowers, like kind of similar to irises. And I could see every part of the flower, every little vein, the pistil, the stamens, even grains of pollen. I could see every part of the flower. And I looked a little further and I could see a grove upon grove of trees. And I was focused on this infinite number of trees. They were like kind of like aspen trees, and they were quaking. Yet I could see every leaf on every tree and every vein on every leaf on every tree, as if it was right in front of my face. And I realized the flowers were moving, the grass was moving, the leaves were moving, but there was no wind. They were all moving in the light of God, and they were all alive. And the most remarkable thing is they were moving to the song of the grass. The grass was singing the praises of God, and everything was moving in that light. So as I looked further, I could see this pathway winding around through the hills, through the trees. And it was started out kind of narrow, kind of like the yellow brick road in The Wizard of Oz. Started out kind of narrow and then widened. And I could see people coming towards me, but I couldn't make out any faces. And they were singing. They too were singing the praises of God. It was like the same song as the song of the grass. And at that moment, Jesus was right there. He appeared right next to me, and he said, "You have to go back. You didn't die." That's what he said. I kind of felt like I didn't die enough, but he said, "You have to go back. You didn't die." And I looked at him and I shook my head. I said, "No, I'm not going back." And I buried my face in God's chest and wrapped my arms around God again. And I was not going back. And Jesus said, "You didn't die. You have to go back." And I said, "No, I'm not going back." Finally, he took my hand and he pulled me off God's lap, and he just said, "You didn't die. You have to go back." And I started screaming at him, "I'm not going back. I'm not going back. I'll feel pain. I'm not going back." But he took me back. And this time there was no flying. There was no fun. It was just bam, right above my body. So here I am with Jesus right above my body, and I could see Charlie, the ranch owner, kneeling next to my body. He was crying and he was praying. I could see my sisters crying. There was chaos everywhere. He had actually brought my horse out, which I had seen before I left the area, which before Jesus and I left, I saw that Charlie had hopped on my horse and ridden out on her when she went back to the barn. And I didn't want to get back in that body. I didn't know how I was going to get back in that body. I was kind of laying on my side, and Jesus just took me and shoved me in my body. It was almost like being vacuumed in, like, and once I got in my body, he shoved me in so hard I hit my face. I actually hit the inside of my skull. And I've never felt so claustrophobic in my entire life. It was the worst feeling to be trapped in my body. But Jesus was in my body with me. The only way I can describe it is to say because this is what struck me at the time. He smoothed my arms into my arms. He smoothed my legs into my legs. He made me whole again, but he was still in there with me. And before he left, he said, "Your life is in good hands," which I actually said to him, "Well, what about everyone else? Isn't their life in good hands? What do they, chop liver?" And then he just started laughing. He smiled at me, and I knew what he meant, which was, come good, come bad, whatever happens in life, your life is in good hands. And he left, but he left, but I still felt him there. I still felt his presence. And I didn't know how anything worked in my body. I honestly didn't know how to do anything, but I managed to take a breath and crack open an eye. And I said, "Charlie." And he just said, "Thank God, thank God," threw me over my horse, which was a bad thing, but he was panicked. He was very panic stricken, and put me in the car, drove right past the hospital, took me home, carried me up to my bed. And it wasn't till the next day, when I still couldn't walk, that my mom realized I was in pretty bad shape. And I ended up in the hospital for quite a long time. I unfortunately didn't get appropriate care, but I healed anyway, which, basically God healed me. There's no other reason I should have healed. I had a lot of very serious injuries. And I was back in school by that fall, I was on crutches for a long time, but that's the story. That's the basic story. It changed me. I knew the minute I woke up, and I did tell my little sister when I was laying in bed and she stayed with me. I told her everything that had happened, but it was pretty difficult to talk at that point. And in the hospital, my parents came to see me the second night I was in the hospital. I told them everything that happened, which didn't make them happy, but here we are.
And what is so remarkable about your story is that you were Jewish, you were not a Christian, and yet Jesus was the one who greeted you.
Mm-hmm. And I knew exactly who he was. I knew this was Jesus, and I knew that I'd known him my entire life. I'd always prayed. I had believed in God. Even despite my parents' disbelief, I had believed in God because the world to me, even as a child, didn't make sense without God. And when Jesus was showing me my life review, I saw that when I was praying and I had the sense that God was sitting right by the head of my bed listening to me, I saw that Jesus was indeed sitting right by the head of my bed listening to me. And it is so interesting, so fascinating to be with Jesus, watching your life review and seeing Jesus with you as a child. So you've got both Jesuses there. You've got Jesus with you in the present when you're dead, and Jesus showing you that he was still there in the past. It's just, it's very interesting. It's not something that's easy to describe.
And at the time, you didn't realize that it was Jesus who you were praying to. So what does that say to you in terms of the paths that there are to heaven?
Well, Jesus said something to me when we were at some point in my, when I was with him, and he actually took his finger and he wrote it on my heart. And it's very hard to explain, and a lot of people will misunderstand, but he said something like, all paths lead to truth, all roads lead to God, or all roads lead to truth, all paths lead to God. Now, he didn't mean anything goes. That's not what he was talking about. What he meant was, in the end, he is the truth, and you will see him, you will face him. And in the very end, and it took me a while to I had to read my own scriptures to see what our own prophets and our own scriptures talked about. But in the end, everyone will face judgment, the living and the dead. God will judge the living and the dead. And that's what he was talking about. He wasn't saying, I don't care what you do whatever you want on earth. You're all going to go to the same place. And I knew that wasn't the case, because I actually had this vision of, at the time, Hitler and Anne Frank. And I knew they weren't, that there was a difference between how we lived our life, what we did. And I wish I could describe this better, but no, I learned, I won't, number one, I won't judge anyone. And as a hospice nurse, which I am, I don't know what's in anyone's heart at the end of their lives. Sometimes people can tell me, sometimes they can't. So I'm going to assume that Jesus is there waiting for every single person and until the very last microsecond, nanosecond. So I simply will not judge what people are doing in their heart and in their soul in their last minutes. I won't.
So when you say we're judged, is that more in terms of how we live out our life and how we treat other people?
Yes, I got the distinct impression that Jesus is really concerned about how we treat other people. He's also concerned about how we treat ourselves and how we behave. But the interesting thing was, when we were having a life review and he was showing me things, he didn't say, quit smoking, quit using drugs. He didn't seem to be worried about that. He was concerned about how I viewed God and how I viewed other people, how I related to God and how I related to people. That seemed to be his two concerns, which is interesting since that is scriptural. But I barely read my own scriptures. I didn't know anything about the New Testament. I had a copy of the New Testament, which I mostly kept to irritate my parents, but I hadn't really looked at it. So I didn't know what he'd said. I mean, the New Testament was almost like, if you touch this book, your hand's going to burst into flames in my house. So it wasn't something I read. I just thought, like what my dad said. If you read my book, you know that my dad said Jesus Christ is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on mankind. So that stuck with me until I actually met him. And then I knew he wasn't a hoax.
And so when he said there are many paths, I'm trying to understand what he meant by that.
Well, he said, actually what he said is, all paths lead to truth, all roads lead to God. And
Okay.
and my impression was not that every single path leads to God. My impression is that in the end, when you die, you will see the truth of your life, the truth of your actions, and the truth of God, the truth of Jesus. And there's no avoiding that. That's what you're going to see. And what happens when you see Jesus, or when you see whatever happens, I don't know. It's not something it's not something I can explain easily. I understood it very clearly when I was dead.
Yeah.
When I'm alive, and I don't want to mislead anyone and say everything all leads to God. Just be a good person. One would hope that being a good person will count for something. That's what one would hope and pray, that being a good person in the end will mean something. But I can't say that. I don't know that. Jesus didn't tell me you can be anything you want, and I will still. Now, he did say you can be anything you want and he'll still be there for you, but I don't know what happens after you die. So the honest truth is, Jesus didn't show me what happens to other people. He showed me. That's all I can say.
And yet you were Jewish.
Yeah. It was weird. I'm Jewish. I shouldn't. And that's something Christians have said to me, and I am a Messianic Jew. I'm still Jewish, but I believe that Jesus is absolutely the Messiah, our Messiah and the world's Messiah. So Christians have said to me, but you shouldn't have seen him because you weren't saved. Well, no, I wasn't saved at the time, but who's Jesus going to save if not the unsaved? We need to be saved more than anybody. And I think that because people will also say, well, why didn't you see more? Well, I didn't die enough. I was dead, but I wasn't dead. I wasn't permanently dead. So I didn't see everything, but it did change my life. And I think the proof is in the pudding. If you die, you have a near-death experience, how does it change you? What do you do with your life when you come back? That's the most important thing. I knew my life would never be the same. And it wasn't easy. My life has not been easy since that moment. But Jesus is still there. Jesus is always there. And he's been there for me. Well, even before I knew he was there for me, but he's been there for me with me being aware of that since I met him.
And to me, when I hear about the transformations that you and really all the other people that I've interviewed, to me, that right there is the proof that something profound did indeed happen. It wasn't just our brains. It wasn't something that we were deceived, but it was something very real.
It was more real than this. It was more real than talking to you. It's the most real thing that's ever happened to me in my life. This is real. Earth is real. We're here for a purpose. We're here for a reason. God has a purpose for us. But heaven is more real than anything I've experienced ever. So, yeah, it does change you. And I knew that the moment I came back. I'm actually working on another book to kind of expand upon how it changed me, because in this first book, I continue with a few years after my near-death experience, but I don't get into the changes that happened. There were some immediate changes, and then there were some changes that were long-term. And nothing happens overnight, but you change, A, as you mature, B, as you learn more, and C, as you read more. Jesus did tell me, which I can't place it in the linear sort of time frame of being dead, but at one point he held a book and told me to read everything I could, learn everything I could about not only life, but him, but about God. And it was this white book. And I was kind of thinking, because in Judaism, we have a concept of the book of life, that every person has a book of where all their deeds are recorded. So I sort of got the notion that that was my book that he was holding. But I couldn't put it in, I don't know when that happened. And when you're dead, time is different. And for me, either I had all the time in the world or there was no time. It simply didn't exist. So I had no idea how much time passed. For me, it was an eternity with him, with God. But I think on earth, maybe 5 minutes, no more, certainly no more than 7 minutes had passed. And I think it was right around 5 minutes. And I've checked with my sisters and they think it was right around 5 minutes that I was dead.
Well, Heidi, I have a lot more questions for you. I want to
Okay.
find out more about what Jesus looked like, some of the experiences that you had with him while you were there. But let's go ahead and take that into part 2.
Okay. Thank you.
Once again, I am just blown away by my guest. I so enjoyed talking to Heidi. What an experience that she had. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you thought was the most interesting part of her near-death experience, because there were so many things. I thought it was fascinating that she was riding on the waves. It was so much fun. She said the funnest thing she'd ever done in her life. Just that was really incredible. And then the fact that, she sat on God's lap, and just her description of that, there were just so many things. So tell me what stood out most to you. I love hearing your thoughts on this. And then also, of course, if you liked it, give it a like. I always appreciate that as well. Or if you're not sure what to say, you can always just type in "made it," which lets me know that you've made it this far in watching the video. So part 2 is, I think, extremely interesting too, because it's just packed with more information. And of course, I'm going to ask her in part 2, what does Jesus look like? And she gives a lot of details from head to toe, what she saw with Jesus. And we get into a lot more. There's the life review. There's so many things that we discussed. So I do hope that you'll come back for part 2. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate it. Thanks for joining me on Beyond with Heather Tesch. Please add comments and questions you'd like future guests to answer. Also, if you liked what you heard, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe. That'll help keep this podcast going. You can also go to Beyond with Heather Tesch to look for more episodes.